Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few logistical details. My name is Supriya Pandey, and I'm a senior global consultant at Amritt. If you are logged in, you should see before you the first slide of the presentation. Please maximize the browser window so that it covers your entire screen. You will also see a webinar applet on the side, which will allow you to send us questions throughout the session. The speaker, Gunjan Bagla, will answer the questions either through the course of the session or at the very end. In case you run into any technical issues, please call 1-805-617-7001. You might be asked for a meeting ID, which you can retrieve from the confirmation email we sent you, and it is also available at the bottom of the webinar applet. During the course of the webinar, if time permits, we will be conducting interactive polls and would really appreciate your participation. If there are any questions after the webinar, please feel free to email us at usa@amritt.com. Again, that's usa@amritt.com. I now want to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Gunjan Bagla. Gunjan, in fact, just had an article in Aviation Week last month about selling into the Indian defense market. So before I read his bio to you, I just want to let you know that if any of you are interested in that article, please send us a quick email and we will send you a link to that article. Gunjan Bagla is the managing director of Amritt and has over 25 years of industry experience in marketing and sourcing. Mechanical engineering graduate of the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur in India, Gunjan holds an MBA with honors from Southern Illinois University. He has previously held senior positions in large corporations as well as been an entrepreneur himself. Based in California, he is the author of the book, Business in 21st Century India, How to Profit Today from Tomorrow's Most Exciting Market. Gunjan also created the executive seminar, Business with India at Caltech, the California Institute of Technology. As the India expert, he has been quoted in the New York Times, Financial Times, and has appeared on television stations like BBC, Fox, and Bloomberg. So without further ado, we can get started with the webinar. Gunjan, over to you.
Thank you, Supriya, and welcome to all of you who have joined in. I saw on our registration list today that we have not only registrants and attendees from North America, we have people joining in from Europe, so good evening to you. And we even have some people from Asia and Australia, and I think the appropriate greeting at this time might be good morning. We really appreciate all of you being up at such odd hours to attend this live webinar, and we'll try to make it worth your while. This webinar is made all the more useful if you ask me your particular question. And that's one thing that Supriya brought up earlier as well. There is a question box on the applet. Please send me any and all questions that you have, and we'll try and do the best we can to answer them in a manner that applies to the audience. We have a fairly diverse group of people, and so I will try and address my remarks to a broad audience, who want to look at selling into businesses, into industry, and into the central and state governments in India. This is not really about a specific sector today or about consumer markets and products. In fact, we concluded a webinar on that subject. If any of you are interested in that, send us an email separately. And let's get started. The first thing I'd like to do, in fact, is find out a little bit more about the audience and run an interactive poll just in a minute or two. Let's give you the agenda first. We'll talk about why you should care about India now. Many of you may already know the answer to this and have come to this webinar for that reason, but I'll give you some of my takes or my other clients' takes. Then we'll go through quickly a number of sectors that matter, and this is again not meant to be an exclusive list, an exhaustive list. It's really to illustrate how wide and how large the opportunities in India are. We'll talk about some of the key success factors in how to win in India, and implied in that are some of the mistakes you don't want to make, because others have made them and some of our clients have made them on their dime. And if you listen to this webinar, you will be perhaps eliminating some of those from the mistakes that you might make. And I'll also tell you about what you should do next in order to continue your success journey towards it. So let's try and run our first poll. I want to get a sense of what is the extent of your India sales today. Okay, is the poll running?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So the question I want you to answer is, what is the extent of your India sales? And the choices are none or minimal. India represents less than 10% of my overall business, for my business unit if you're in a large company, or more than 10%. This is again just for me to get a barometer on the nature of the attendees today. There are clearly companies operating in the US today who are getting 40 to 60% of their sales in India, and I'll give you one such example later on. Right now I'm just trying to get a barometer read. This is also a good time, if you've already taken the poll, to send any questions that are on your mind about things you don't know or don't understand about India. There's no such thing as an inappropriate question. So ask me whatever it is that is on your mind that worries you or concerns you about doing business in India, and we'll take our best stab at it. Okay. I will close this poll and share the results. So it looks like we have an audience where most people are new to the Indian market, and there really isn't anybody who's getting more than 10% of their business there. So I will gear my comments to that kind of background. We sometimes have people who've been in India 10 and 20 years and still need help, understandably so. But I will focus this webinar today on the texture of the audience that we have. So in Business Week a couple of years ago, I wrote an article talking about how India will be a top 10 trading partner to the United States within a fairly short period of time.
Gunjan, sorry to interject, but we've missed your screen again, so you might want to share it.
Okay. The screen visible now?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, great. So here I'm talking about predictions that we made, and we believe that India will soon enter the top 10 trading partner list for the United States in a fairly rapid period of time. It was not so long ago that India was the 29th largest trading partner to the US in countries such as Belgium and far smaller countries ahead of India. That situation is changing rapidly as two-way trade between the countries continues to rise. We think that it's entirely possible that by 2025, India will be same kinds of leagues as China, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and perhaps one other country which we can't say what it might be. So keep this in mind as to what this means for your career inside of your company and your company growth. How much do you understand India, a country where your sales currently are 86% of you say that your sales there are none or minimal, and only 14% have some degree of sales there. The future is going to be very different from what it is to, what you are seeing today, and be ready for that. And that's what we are trying to accomplish in today's webinar. One background factor working for you is that Indians in general are in love with the United States. You see the picture on the top left here. This is one I took in the southern city of Chennai, and it's an ad from one of the cell phone companies about the international calls, but you will see that the images are all recognizably American. The Statue of Liberty, the Hollywood sign, an American-looking school bus, and perhaps the Golden Gate Bridge. And the point I'm trying to make is that the cell phone company understands that their target market on the streets of Chennai recognizes that all of those are American symbols. And this is not necessarily the case if you go to Shanghai or a smaller city in China. You see on the graph on the right side that well over 70% of Indians, according to this Ipsos study, have a positive view of the United States. If you go down the list and look at some of the other BRIC countries, Russia is down here, China is up here with about 34% of the people feeling positively, and Brazil is here with about 36%. So you encounter a welcoming audience when you go to India. In that Aviation Week article that I wrote last month, I pointed out that India's Prime Minister has a daughter who lives in the United States. The Foreign Minister studied in Washington, D.C. The Home Minister is a Harvard MBA. And the list goes on and on in terms of the affinity to the United States. Let's move on. I'm going to try and give you a summary of India in one slide here. It's a $1.4 trillion economy, probably about 1.6 by now. And if you look at purchasing power parity terms, and this is taken from the CIA fact book, which you can readily access on the web, that India is today the fourth largest economy in the world, next only to the United States, Japan, and China. Exports from the United States to India are growing pretty rapidly. What's more interesting to me is that while the economy is growing from anywhere from 6 to 9%, that the tax receipts, and I mean indirect tax collected through sales tax, excise tax, and so on, are actually growing at double-digit rates, which really is a more accurate measure of the growth of the Indian economy in many ways, because a lot of the percentage of the population does not pay income tax, and often the growth in small companies is underreported. The graph that you see is taken from a Morgan Stanley study several years ago, and it plots on the x-axis the years from the beginning of economic progress, and on the y-axis the per capita GDP adjusted for purchasing power parity. It may be a little hard to read at this side, so let me just point out that India is down here about 15 years since, this is about 5 years old, this slide. It shows India being 15 years away from its liberalization, which began in 1991, whereas China is here about 25 years away from its beginning of liberalization. And up here you see Hong Kong and Japan, which really began economic growth right after the Second World War. And what it's showing is that there's a predictable pattern where growth is slow at first and then accelerates dramatically and then only stabilizes once it begins to approach Western levels. So you have a very steep growth curve ahead for the Indian economy, and this should be helpful for most of you on the call. Let me give you a little bit of sense of how India's companies are structured. And as you look at selling into corporate India, it is very, very different from thinking about corporate China. Many people come to India having established some success in China, and almost everything you have learned in China needs to be discarded for appropriate success in the Indian market. So one of the things you have to keep in mind is who owns these companies. Some are family owned, others are what are called family promoted, where the so-called owning family may only have a single-digit percentage of the stock they own, but the rest is so widely distributed that in effect they get to control the company. Many of the other shareholders are friendly banks or other organizations, and so you will hear people talk about the Jindal family or the Birla family or the Aditya Birla family in particular, and these are powerful families that control some of India's largest companies. There are other companies that are government-owned, something like the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited in Bangalore, India's aircraft producer, is 100% owned by India's Ministry of Defense. You can also have companies in India that are very much investor-owned, similar to the industrial infrastructure we have in the U.S. Companies in the U.S. such as Dow or General Motors have a very widespread ownership. And in India, I began my career at Larsen & Toubro, which was started by 2 Danish immigrants to India and is probably one of the most widely held stocks in India today. There are then companies that are owned by foreign investors, they're either subsidiaries or minority investments from foreign companies, and many of these entities are publicly traded on the Indian Stock Exchange because it's very easy for people to get listed and traded there, and there's plenty of liquidity in the Indian market for to be able to raise capital there. So one way to distinguish companies is the type of ownership, which I want to say is separate from the type of management that they have, and many companies may be family owned but professionally managed. And one example is a consumer product company called Dabur, which is about $700 or $800 million in sales. It's still owned, quote unquote. The majority, significant stock is owned by the Burman family, but the managing director, CEO, and all of the upper management typically are professionals who have worked at companies such as Levers and others, and have then come to work for this company. They have MBAs from the equivalents of the Indian Institutes of Management, or sometimes from American schools. And so it's very, very professionally run. The family may get involved in huge decisions, but in the day-to-day decisions and where to locate a factory and how to sell, all of that is handled by the professionals who run the company. And certainly most purchasing decisions will be handled by the management. You can also look at companies that are standalone or companies that are part of a so-called conglomerate or a group. And so you will hear people say, well, I'm working with a Tata Group company or a Bhartiya Group company, and they may have distinct and different names, but they may have similar styles of management. They may all be separately publicly traded. Some may be far more profitable than others, but there's some commonality that you need to understand, and of course they will favor buying from one another. And so to some extent it's similar to the Keiretsus or the Chaebols you see in Japan and Korea, but they're not quite as tight. From the Fortune 500 list, there are some Indian companies listed there, and I've got a few examples. Reliance, which now has close to $40 billion in sales and 100,000 employees. Tata Steel, which is the lowest cost producer of steel in the world. It's a 100-year-old company started in India under the British rule, and they made big news in 2007 when they bought the successor to the former British Steel. So the colonized country ended up buying a company from the former colonizer, Great Britain or the United Kingdom, and today Tata Steel has well over $30 billion in sales and is one of the most efficiently run companies in the world. Another very different example in the Fortune 500 is India's largest bank, which is a descendant of the British Imperial Bank, but has been called the State Bank of India for many decades. They got a listing on the London Stock Exchange some years ago, and today they have well over 11,000 branches. They are not India's most profitable bank because they have a significant ownership from the government and take it upon themselves by government dictate to provide low-cost loans in rural areas, many of those which never get collected. So the most profitable bank in India is actually ICICI Bank. It used to be government-owned, but now pretty much run privately. On the Fortune 500 in India, you also have many government-owned public sector undertakings that have some degree of stock ownership from the public at large. Indian Oil Corporation, the Hindustan Petrochemicals, the former Oil and Natural Gas Commission, which is now simply called ONGC. They are the drilling and exploration arm of the Indian oil enterprise. India imports most of its oil today, but is also a major processor, and I'll get to that in a bit. So you have to determine which of these companies that you are going to be selling to. Are you selling to the really large ones, the small ones, the independents, what kind of management they have? All of this you should know well in advance of starting to engage a company. Let's talk very briefly about Amritt. Here's a picture of me by the Taj Mahal, and these are visiting American executives as part of a trade mission that I was involved in. And I'm right here in the middle. This is me. And then there were about 20 of us that went to Delhi and Bangalore, and some of us took a side trip to Agra. Our clients are typically Global 2000 companies, but we do sometimes work with smaller entities if it makes sense for both sides. Our mission is to help American companies, Western companies in general, I should say, overseas companies, to profit from India. we seldom take on clients in India. Our primary focus is on helping people with market access, with entry, and with growth, and we do the whole spectrum of things in this. We are not PowerPoint consultants. We actually get our hands dirty and do things on the ground. I travel to India personally along with major clients many times a year, and then we have senior people on the ground in India that do much of this. Again, this is not a sales pitch about Amritt, but just to give you some background about where I am coming from and where we are coming from. So we will talk about some sectors that matter, and then we will start looking at additional factors. But let me try and run one more poll in time. So let's ask, where do you expect your largest chunk of sales to come? Okay. So do you expect your sales from the government, from large private sector companies, from small and medium enterprises in India? Again, this is all focused on India. Take a moment, if you can, please, to answer this poll. And again, I want to remind you, this is a good time to send me any questions through the question applet to the question box on this applet here. I do encourage everyone to participate in the poll. Your results, your names and your companies are not shown in the results. It's just an aggregate level. So you won't be giving away any secrets by participating in this poll. I see a few people are still adding their votes. And those of you who voted already, again, please send me questions, because we want to make this your webinar. I could go on talking on my own for hours, but I want this to be interactive and useful directly to your current questions. Alrighty, let's close the poll and let's share the results. So if you see, a large plurality of you are planning to sell to small and medium enterprises. That poses some special challenges that I should try and address right now. The next largest chunk of you are planning to sell to the Indian government and its related entities. And some of you are planning to sell to large private sector companies. Let's talk a little bit about small and medium enterprises. As in the United States, small and medium enterprises make up the bulk of the Indian economy. And some of the small ones are really micro, and some are far more micro than they need to be for various reasons that are unique to India. This is a point that I do want to emphasize. If you go into a family-owned type of enterprise, you may find that the individuals involved in the company may own 4, 5, 10, or 20 separate companies. And each of them may have, say, 80 or 90 employees, and they are staying below a certain threshold. Or you may find another configuration where several of them have 400 and something employees and nobody goes above 500. There are many reasons people do this. Most of this having to do with government regulations. There are certain kinds of rules that kick in when you exceed a certain size. And those who want to avoid the purview of additional inspection and rules try to set up interrelated companies so that to the extent possible, they can forego the additional oversight and responsibility that comes with a larger size. So be careful when you look at these small and medium enterprises. Sometimes you may think that you are pitching to company A and company B in the same city, and you might think you have two prospects, when indeed you really have one prospect, because behind the scenes, both of those companies are essentially controlled by the same individual. And you may find the negotiation to go a little bit differently once they recognize that you understand those interrelationships. These interrelationships can sometimes change as as families evolve, people get married, people inherit. So it's always a moving target, but it's something that's important to understand. In the medium-sized companies, you need to examine whether they are so-called listed or not, which means that they are publicly traded or not. One of the terms that confuses many Americans is the so-called private limited company versus a public limited company. By American standards, both of those are private corporations, privately held. Public limited does not mean that they are listed or traded on a stock exchange. They're just two kinds of private companies, one with a small number of stockholders and one with a larger number of stockholders. The best analogy I can draw to the U.S. is an S corporation versus a C corporation, but they are both private, untraded companies.
Gunjan, I just want to interject that the poll needs to be closed. We can't see a screen.
So let me close the poll. I just wanted to address this point about small and medium enterprises before moving on. So the poll should be closed now, and we can go and address some of the fast-growing sectors. At the bottom here, you see a picture of President Obama in the city of Mumbai in November 2010, and next to him is the CEO of General Electric, Jeff Amritt, and next to him on the left is Anil Ambani, India's second richest man. On the right of, on the left of President Obama is David Coty, the CEO of Honeywell. This was a 200-person mission that went to India along with the president, and I was privileged to be part of it. But here are some of the sectors listed where tremendous growth is expected in India, and we will talk about some of these as we go on. Here's a great success story from a few years ago. The state of Gujarat is on the western side of India, and on the coast of Gujarat is a city called Jamnagar. You see this picture at the bottom of the screen. There are two giant refineries that were built just outside of Jamnagar, and the second of these refineries opened about 3 years ago. At that point, the city of Jamnagar now has the capacity to process more oil, more crude oil than any place on earth, which is quite surprising because India is not an exporter of oil. It's actually a net consumer, and it depends on foreign countries, mostly in the Middle East, to supply most of the oil. But it also exports some of the processed oil. The second refinery, in fact, was built mostly for export. In the process of building this refinery, Bechtel Corporation of San Francisco at one point had 3,500 engineers deployed on the project, and Black & Veatch also supported part of the development. Companies listed here, such as General Electric and Foxborough and others, sold hundreds of millions of dollars of components and systems, and on the right you see a picture of that refinery coming up. This was taken from the Bechtel website. It's been a huge success. It's one that most people don't know about. It's one of the most modern refineries in the world, one of the most low-cost refineries. It can take low-end crude and process it into gasoline, and American companies had a lot to do with its success and profited handsomely from their work there. So let me talk about some sectors, and I have a picture here of a former local. This is the former CEO of the Southern California Edison and its holding company, John Bryson. Bryson recently took over as the Secretary of Commerce, and one of his first overseas trips is to lead a trade mission addressing the Indian infrastructure market. He's headed over there in just a few days and will travel to Delhi, Jaipur, and Mumbai, looking to see how American companies can get a bigger piece of the pie in the developments around airports and harbors, around the roadways and bridges. You see a picture at the right of the Delhi Metro, which is one of the most successful construction projects taken up in India. The head of the Delhi Metro has become a folk hero in India because it is reputed that his projects have finished under budget and ahead of schedule, which is almost unheard of in public transit projects, and certainly almost a miracle in India. Today, the success of the Delhi Metro is leading to new metro train systems across the country, and certainly American companies can get a big piece of that business in terms of engineering and construction, as well as delivery of components and systems. The Indian Railways employs over 1 million people. It carries more passengers than any other railway system in the world. and also carries a substantial portion of the freight traffic in India. Indian Railways is modernizing dramatically, and GE and others have been successful in selling modern locomotives to this market. I think some of you on the call are in the broad infrastructure market, and I would welcome any specific questions relating to that. Let's move on now to defense, and we have a whole separate practice around defense. So I could run a 1-hour workshop very easily on this subject. I'm only going to restrict myself to a few remarks in the minutes that we have. India recently announced a $10.5 billion purchase of fighter aircraft, and this particular order went to Dassault of France with their Rafale aircraft. However, American companies have won large orders. Boeing is getting ready to ship the first of its P-8Is. This is a reconnaissance aircraft, a modified Boeing 737, and the Indian Navy is the first overseas customer. So they've just delivered the product to the US Navy, and ahead of any NATO countries, India will be receiving the product next. India has received delivery of the Lockheed Hercules C-130J. That's the plane pictured at the bottom right. That's the first one that was delivered about a year and a half ago. I think they've received the second one as well. It's a $1 billion order, expected to go up to as much as $2 billion. Today, there is tremendous scope for any company in the defense or homeland security business, whether they are located in the US or Canada or elsewhere, to participate in India's $100 billion expansion of defense needs. According to the Swedish International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, India today is the largest importer of defense equipment, whether it is for the Army, Navy, Air Force, or Coast Guard. And if any of your work hinges upon that market, while it is a complex process selling into India, it can be extremely, extremely profitable to address that market today. The average energy consumption per capita in India is extremely low, and the government recognizes that economic growth depends on providing reliable electrical energy to hundreds of millions of Indian consumers, many of whom are living in situations where they don't have reliable electrical power. Now, much of this growth, unfortunately, will come from fossil fuels such as coal. India has large reserves of coal, and American companies are already being successful in selling turbines and generators to this market. But India absolutely has to depend on other sources. It's not a matter of choice. So nuclear in India is barely controversial. Today, India has only 4 gigawatts, 4,000 megawatts roughly of electric power generation, and they expect this to go up to 30 gigawatts in the next 25 or 30 years. Today, they're running about 21 plants across India, and many of them are fairly small and based on heavy water technology, but there's tremendous possibility for anybody who supplies component systems, consulting, advice, guidance, anything to do with India's nuclear infrastructure. This market was completely closed until just recently because of historical factors that I won't get into, but today it's wide open for American, Canadian, and Western companies in general to participate. The solar, hydroelectric, biomass, all of these are big in India as well, or going to be big. Solar was almost non-existent in India until recently, and the government announced what they call the Jawaharlal Nehru Solar Mission, or the JNURM, and Jawaharlal Nehru was India's first Prime Minister, and so it's in his honor and memory, and they want to go up to 20,000 megawatts by 2020. The state of Gujarat announced what they said would be the world's largest solar farm that they are building, and Rajasthan has, the neighboring state, which is largely a desert state, has also announced some fairly large solar farms. Currently, much of the solar construction is in the south of the country, but again, they're very small and growing fast. Since so many of you will be selling to the Indian government, let's talk about how the Indian government is structured. It's really on a British model, a parliamentary system, And so there is the Prime Minister who is the executive. The President is largely ceremonial. There are well over 40 ministries in India, and on the next slide I'll show you some of them. Within the ministries, there are departments. So what we call the Department of Defense or the Department of State here in India will be called the Home Ministry or the Foreign Ministry or the Defense Ministry. And within those ministries, there may be departments, and sometimes this nomenclature confuses people. Under many of the ministries are corporations that are run in a quasi-independent manner. All of the stock or some of the stock may be owned by the government, by that particular ministry. So the board is appointed by the ministry, but these are run like separate corporations, with the exception that the ownership is rests with the government. And I'll give you some examples of that during the question hour if necessary. The people who lead these ministries are called ministers. They are cabinet ministers, state ministers, assistant ministers, and so on. And then the bureaucrats who run the departments are called secretaries. So when you talk to the Secretary of Commerce in India, you are not talking to the Minister of Commerce. Sometimes the secretary, a career bureaucrat, can have just as much or more power than the minister. So both need to be addressed, but it's a little bit of a different system. Some people, when they first look at it, want to say that a secretary is like a civil service person, but that grossly understates the power and expertise and sophistication. To become a secretary, you have to go through fairly grueling exam. People, the top 0.1% of India's population would qualify to get in there, and these people spend their career struggling to get up to that rank. So they are very highly intelligent and talented. India does have a federal system, and there's 28 states with their own government structure. I won't dwell on that very much right now, but you have to determine whether you're selling to the federal government, or which is called the union government, or the central government in India. On the next slide, I have some of the 40 ministries listed. All of them, I just want to highlight, say, the Defense Ministry, which could be a customer for many of you, the Home Ministry, which is roughly the equivalent of the Department of Homeland Security, although they handle a lot more than Homeland Security does in the case of India. So they have some regulatory impact on visas and stuff like that for foreign travelers and work permission and such like. But the reason I'm highlighting them here is that they also control India's paramilitary, the National Security Guard, the Tibetan Border Police, the National Investigation Agency, and many of those agencies are spending billions of dollars today in upgrading their systems. Indian Railways, down here in bold, are also owned by the government. Railways were nationalized right at the time India became independent in 1947, and the railways employ well over 1 million people. They have huge need to be able to upgrade and modernize, and today they are eager to buy Western product and Western technology. I also want to highlight another special department which reports directly to the Prime Minister. It's not under any ministry. There are a few such departments. Space is one of them I won't talk about, but the Department of Atomic Energy, actually headquartered in Mumbai, reports into the Prime Minister, and one of its major units is the Nuclear Power Corporation of India, a public sector utility that runs all the nuclear power plants. They also own the nuclear fuel complex that processes the uranium, and they own the Uranium Corporation of India, which does the mining for uranium across the country. Again, I won't dwell on this in any more detail unless someone has questions about it, but you need to understand what the role of the federal government will be in being a customer or being a regulator for your particular industry. And the government in India is certainly omnipresent, although it's not quite like China, where in China most corporations are actually owned by the government. That's not the case. Let's talk about some other sectors. We just completed the Oscars. I live here in Los Angeles, so I definitely have to mention that. And at the bottom right, you have a picture of what we call the God of Hollywood, none other than Steven Spielberg right here. Spielberg made news a couple of years ago when he decided that he wanted to take DreamWorks out of the Viacom Paramount empire and make it an independent company again. At that point, he turned to India's second richest man, uh, right here, Anil Ambani. He's married to the former Miss India, Tina Muneem. She was Miss India about 30 years ago. And he invested $300 million in DreamWorks and owns 51% of it. They've had some successes. I mentioned a few of their recent movies. One of their movies actually won an Oscar for I think, Best Supporting Actor this time. And I think you'll see a lot more coming out of there. But the more important point I want to point out is that American media is doing things in India that they've never done elsewhere. Warner Brothers and Disney and others are producing content in India for the Indian audience. So they are hiring Indian actors, Indian writers, Indian directors, but then adding a Hollywood flair to it. And it's quite an interesting thing. This is not something Hollywood is used to doing. They're starting to have some success with it. And if you serve the entertainment business in any way, or if you're a content producer yourself, I think it's good to observe what's happening, how success in India will be laid out. The media business is extremely important in India. And it's no surprise that the biggest superstar of all, Lady Gaga, decided to make a trip to India. And like most Western celebrity females, when she arrived in India, she decided to wear a sari, although she wore a sari in this picture in a way that I have never seen an Indian woman wear one. But that's Lady Gaga for you. Let's talk very briefly about the Indian middle class and its drive towards consumer products. Again, we had a separate webinar on that subject of consumer goods in general, but many of you are selling business or industrial products that will ultimately be used to build consumer products, and that's why I'm mentioning it here. There's some pretty astonishing numbers you see in India. So Ford and GM are both making serious money in India. In a big way, although they are still small players compared to the Koreans and the Indians and the Japanese in the automotive market. I think both Ford and GM have now figured out how to succeed in India, and you will see their sales growing. We keep lamenting about the decline of American manufacturing and the decline of American brands, but Whirlpool USA continues to defy all of those trends, and in India they are beating the hires from China and the Samsungs and Lucky Gold Stars from Korea, and the largest selling clothes washer in India is Whirlpool. Whirlpool is also very successful in the refrigerator market and so on. And of course, many of their factories in India then require American technology, American products to be able to build them up. Sophia, do we have any questions right now? Shall we take a...
Yes, we do actually. Somebody from the audience is asking that in their previous job, they had few Indian customers and had a hard time getting payments from them at net 30 terms. Is there a way to make things accountable and smooth?
That's a great question. I think one has to do one's due diligence on the customer, and before extending net terms across the oceans, one has to be sure that it's the appropriate thing to do. Very often we recommend to our clients to start with something more conservative, via advance payment or letters of credit or cash on delivery. All of those are definitely workable in India. Now clearly the client would prefer, the Indian customer would prefer net 30, net 60, net 90, and sometimes they'll take net 90 when you give them net 30. That's just called cash management in India. But today, in fact, since the recession in 2008, I think we see the same tendencies in American companies. Most large companies have stopped offering net 30 terms to their suppliers and have switched to net 60 and more. So this factor is not unique, I think, in India. What might be unique is that you might end up offering net terms to a company that does not deserve them, and you can't just turn to a Dun & Bradstreet or the equivalent to be able to get that information. You need due diligence on the ground about the company, its management, its practices, and you need sensing devices to be able to tell you about changes on those. Depending on the kind of business or volume of business you're doing, that can be a little more involved to do in India, but it's well worth it if you're dealing with significant sums. Is there another question at this time from the audience, or Supriya, shall we wait?
Yeah, we do. How can we tap into the right customer pool? Most of the time, we land up talking with traders.
I would need to know what kind of business this particular company is in, but we almost never get into a consulting engagement with a client without going all the way to the end customer and then working our way backwards from there. In many markets, using an intermediary, a trader, a distributor, a reseller is appropriate, but before you determine which ones you want to talk to or what role they have, it's important to find out where the product or service ultimately ends up and what is the dynamic going on in that individual, that company, that state government's mind, then work your way backwards from there to see which traders, which intermediaries, which distributors make sense, and how are they adding value? Are they simply marking up the product and receiving orders and expecting you to do all the heavy lifting? Or are they adding value? Are they bringing you customers that you might never have received otherwise, and where they'll do better than others? So these are the kinds of things you must establish before engaging with India's market. I think almost without exception, people who don't do that find that they're leaving money on the table. They're really not addressing the entire Indian market to the full satisfaction, and their view of India is limited through this tunnel vision that the traders or distributors provide them. And invariably, I don't care what industry you're in, they'll tell you the same thing. You know, at least in India, I'd say 9 times out of 10, you will hear your price is too high, your quality doesn't quite meet the Indian taste, you need to make 23 changes to your product before any of it will sell, and the Chinese, the Koreans, the Indians, the Bangladeshis, whoever can do it much better, so you need to shape up if you want to be in the Indian market. You hear all of that, and sometimes it's true. But certainly isn't true for Whirlpool, who decided that they wanted to make a premium clothes washer for India and market it in a way in India that nobody else does. And therefore, they're using premium components and being able to outdo higher in Samsung and others to be able to. So yeah, if you depend on intermediaries for all of your sensing information, chances are that you will not find an optimal solution. But let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about services. Now, people might say, what in the world would you do selling American services into India? And you might be surprised. Writing my book, I met the man who runs Western Union's business in India. India is Western Union's largest market. Company based now in the Denver, Colorado area. And essentially, they're no longer in the telegram business. What they do is electronic money transfer, typically in small amounts. But people who are working at the lower end of the spectrum who need to send money home. And so China, India, and Mexico are their largest markets. But people working in first world countries or in some of the Middle Eastern countries are then utilizing their services to send money back to their relatives. They've built up a very robust system in India in collaboration of all things with the Indian Post Office to be able to get money reliably to little towns all over the country. It's been a hugely successful. When you look at the job hunting market in India, you find that the largest player is a company called Naukri.com, which essentially means jobs.com. Now, why am I putting them under the list of American services? Because it turns out that this company started in the venture-funded world with Silicon Valley VCs funding it, funding their growth in India. And Kleiner Perkins is one of the major stockholders. Naukri.com went public some time ago, and Kleiner has certainly done well. The next big site is nominally owned by the so-called Bennett Coleman Group or the Jain family in Mumbai, and it's called Times Jobs, but it's part of the Times Internet Services. And some years ago, Sequoia Capital, the same company that funded Google and Cisco and Yahoo and some of the most famous names in in the technology world, decided to put in a record $35 million to fund the growth of this company. The odd-looking building on the right is the world's most expensive house, if you can call it a house or home. It is the home of India's richest man and the fourth richest person in the world, Mukesh Ambani. It was designed by an American company called Perkins Buswell, and the overall cost, including land, is about $900 million. A few months ago, there was an interesting article in the New York Times about a group dating website called Igniter.com. And the Wharton India newsletter recently featured an interview with their CEO, who discovered that most of the registrants on their group dating site were actually coming from Indian cities. People from India were addressing their needs all the way in New York with this website. Because Indian parents often tend to be conservative and are far more comfortable with their kids going on a group date rather than a two-person date. So 4 or 5 couples may get together and go to a party or an event, and that's far more acceptable. So Igniter actually now has a specific focus on India as a result. So regardless of the kind of service you offer, you may find that there is a market for it in India if you can seek it out. I've just given some examples here. Every time I fly to India, I'm amazed to see the people sitting next to me on flights. I always try and talk to people and find out what they do. And the most interesting types of services offered by American companies that are becoming successful in India. These are just a few examples. I know that many of you on the call are manufacturers, so here's a list of some of the successes in manufacturing. Since we are running short on time, I won't dwell on them. Be happy to take any questions. Supriya, are there other questions that have come in at this time from the audience?
A couple, but we can take them at the end if you want.
Okay, that's fine. Let's get into some of the key success factors. So how can you be successful regardless of the sector that you operate in? One of the things you don't want to do is go in and say, hey, Indians can't be that different from the rest of the world. What worked for me in China or Brazil or South Africa or name your country will work in India. Many of the most successful entrants into India have found that they do things in India that are different from anywhere else. The other thing that I think is important is that you need to be both patient and persistent. There's a lot happening in India. The average Indian CEO is unhappy if his or her company is only growing at 15% per year. And so there's so much going on that you may need to put in a lot more effort to get noticed at first and to get your first few pieces of business. Many of you are new to India, as you mentioned in the poll, so I want to emphasize that don't give up too quickly. And the patience part of it goes along with it. You have to be persistent. You also have to take some time. But be aware, the last message I think is the most important one, that you can make lots of money in India. ExxonMobil is making billions of dollars in India with a very small staff. IBM today is doing dramatically well, offering its full range of services. Boeing has one of its largest backlogs of both defense and civilian aircraft from India, and Boeing's chief competitor Airbus received what they call the largest single order for planes from Indigo Air for the Airbus aircraft some time ago. So it's not just Boeing. Everybody in India, everybody who operates in India who takes the time to understand it can find serious success. So, let's talk about next steps a little. Okay. It does take time to learn about India, and you can never know enough. I am getting ready to go to India soon, and I know that I will learn things in India, even though they call me an expert. I will learn things on this trip that I thought I already knew, and my learning will change. It will change me and will change my client. So you always have to be open to that. You either need to do a whole lot of preparation, or you need to hire a seasoned advisor who understands both countries well. You can't hire a Washington lobbyist to guide you in India. They don't understand Delhi. And you can't hire an Indian company alone to do this because they may not be able to understand your vocabulary as you use terms and concepts, and the hidden assumptions between both are quite different. You really need to go to an advisor who has a strong presence in both countries. We certainly do, but there are others who do as well. And it's very seldom that a winner-take-all, one-step strategy works in India. Most of our clients have succeeded by taking baby steps and then building up. The rest of the points on this slide simply address that issue. So there's a few challenges. You shouldn't jump to conclusions. I won't dwell on that. I think I've addressed it indirectly through my other comments. Remember that while the Indians speak English, they don't think American, and you must take the time to understand what's going on inside the person's head to be able to sell effectively in India. I'd say more failures occur on this account than probably any single factor in all of our consulting. You've got to be able to think Indian. You've got to be able to get inside the people's heads, and all of a sudden everything begins to make sense. Stands to reason, I think, with even some limited studies that the courts in India are quite slow. When the laws are all compliant with WTO recommendations, the practice is pretty challenging. And this affects Indian companies as well as American companies. So there's no discrimination against foreign players in India as there might be in other countries. Remember that in India, you may start as the underdog. You can't go in saying, I'm this great, wonderful American company. I've been successful everywhere else. Now I am ready for you to buy from me. This doesn't work in India. You really have to get to the bottom of the heap and work your way up there, particularly all of you who are relatively new to India. But it's worth doing. We have found tremendous success for people who have taken the time to do it. So the takeaways, as far as I'm concerned, are that India is a big market. The time to expand your initiatives is now. And while this will produce success for your companies, I think it's important for the individuals on the call. I speak fondly of my clients who worked with us for the last 4, 5, and 7 years, that eventually they become heroes within their company. Sometimes it takes a degree of evangelism and patience internally to the company before everybody gets to see the light. But when you do that, you find that you can really progress very rapidly in your career. I think it's something that is well worth doing for most of you on the phone. I think I've covered the points on this slide, so I won't dwell on them further. India will surprise you, and you've got to listen carefully. So Priya, can you tell me any last questions? I know we've run a little bit over today.
Yeah, and I just wanted to let everybody know if there are any questions. This is kind of your last chance to send them in. I will start with the first question we have. Aaron is asking that we have an established dealer in India. Our growth goals will require more locations and possibly other partners. How should we do this?
That's a great question. Often people come to us with this kind of mode where they've had some success, and now they're saying, shall we invest more in that relationship, or shall we find new relationships? The answer obviously depends on the situation. Our approach at Amritt is always to evaluate very carefully what has worked well with the current relationship, and then evaluate what are the limits of the current partner. The limits sometimes are set by the partner themselves, either consciously or unconsciously, or sometimes are set by the American player, again, consciously or unconsciously. If the limits have been set on the American side, we are the hard-nosed third parties who can bring that up and challenge our client and say, if you were only to change A, B, or C, you could double your sales. Or, if you were to approach it slightly differently, you would address one of the reasons why your partner is holding back or why the Indian market is holding back. So our phase one analysis always says, let's go with the assumption that we can make the current relationship more successful. If it turns out that the current relationship in our analysis is dysfunctional or is clearly limited by other external factors that are not likely to change soon, then it makes sense looking at expanding the relationship. And that has to be done carefully because India, even though it's a country of 1.2 billion people, everybody talks to everybody. And so if you think you can do this secretly without your partner knowing, that it's possible, but it's much more difficult than you might imagine because word gets around. So sometimes people will come to us with that kind of request, and we are glad to honor it where we can, and we are also glad to explain its limitations. So we do an analysis of what else is possible, and then come up with a recommendation, ideally with the current partner's collaboration. So the partner will see that getting other people involved is going to be not only good for the U.S. company, but also good for them by getting them more visibility, by getting them management attention in the U.S. that they might not otherwise have seen. This kind of work requires considerable due diligence on the ground in India, and it's not something to be taken lightly. It's also something that cannot be substituted by simply going to a trade show or two, or by responding to emails that come into your website saying, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I want to be able to sell your product or service in India or form a joint venture, and I'm related to the minister, and my brother-in-law used to work for this company or that company. All of that needs to be taken with a spoonful of salt, not just a grain of salt, because you're unlikely to find the best partners for you using that. A lot of diligence on the ground. What's the next question, Supriya?
Yeah, so we are running short on time, so we just have time for one more. Craig is asking, our products are generally meant for system design engineers and defense engineers. We would like to know the best marketing strategies and consumer for getting the business done in India. Consumer research for getting business done in India.
So I would address those two quite separately. The defense market in India is really controlled by the Ministry of Defense. And so often you have a straight path to that supply chain. Depending on the nature of your product, you might sell directly to the ministry or to the armed services. Occasionally you may sell to someone who sells to the Army or Navy or Air Force. You need to, that's an area of, in fact, we have a specialized defense practice where we focus just on that. There's a big trade show coming up in New Delhi in a couple of weeks where I'll be there talking about how to lead in the defense marketplace. It takes a very specialized understanding that is not available largely in India because a handful of individuals within the Ministry of Defense, which overall is millions of people, just I'd say less than 100 people understand exactly how the acquisition process works. And some of it is documented, but the informal parts you need to understand very carefully. As far as systems design engineers, I think being a mechanical engineer myself and having been in similar roles, I can say that system design engineers work similarly worldwide. It's just that you need to have an outreach to them in the Indian market to be able to determine their specific and unique needs. I assume that these are system design engineers designing products for the Indian market. The substantial number of system design engineers in India designing for the global market. And clearly, the way to sell to them would be similar to what you might do anywhere else in the world. But you really need to understand their role. And much of this has to be done eyeball to eyeball, face to face. Often we are asked to do some market study, find out where, the appropriate contacts might exist, conduct some pre-interviews with them, and then rate and rank the places where our clients should visit on a 1 or 2 week or 1 month trip to India, depending on who's visiting. And we can thereby save a lot of time and the risk for our Western clients who are headed in that direction. Sometimes people bring us after that first trip, and they find that some meetings are far more productive than others, and then let them explore how to flesh that out. So I think that's all the time we have. If you want to send me additional questions, please use the email address listed here, and we will get to them. And I really enjoyed this interaction. Thank you so much, and I'll hand it back to Supriya for some final comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Gunjan. And thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar today. We hope it was informative. If you have any additional questions, please do email us at usa@amritt.com, and the email is listed on the final screen in front of you, final slide in front of you. Please make sure as you exit the webinar that you do so by closing the webinar applet. When you do this, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey, and we would really appreciate your feedback. If you have any friends or colleagues who you think might benefit from a similar webinar, please do have them register on our website, www.amritt.com. That's www.amritt.com. And we will notify them of any upcoming webinars. Thank you very much for attending today, and have a nice day. Goodbye.